The number that broke the accord was read aloud on an ordinary afternoon, by a clerk with a cold, in a voice too bored to understand what it was saying. Senator Thessery Vaughan had convened the quorum to dispose of a housekeeping matter. That was how it had been described to her, and that was how she had described it to herself, a housekeeping matter. There was an irregularity in the reckoning records concerning the human frontier, a scatter of anomalous reports, a handful of worlds that had not resolved the way the models said they should, and the Guild wanted a finding, a tidy paragraph the Accord could file, so that the anomaly could be classified and shelved and everyone could get back to the actual business of governing 4/5 of a galaxy. Vaughan had presided over 1,000 such tidyings in a long and reasonable career. She expected this one to take an afternoon. For the record, Vaughan said, the clerk will read the count of unresolved human reckonings, so that the quorum may see the scale of the matter and dispose of it. The clerk stood. He had a cold, and he read the way clerks read, flatly, from the bottom of a long day. Unresolved reckonings, human frontier, worlds on which force was applied to the doctrinal threshold and no fold was recorded. He paused to consult the tally. 231. The chamber, which had been half listening, stopped being half listening. Vaughan looked up from her papers. She had expected a number like 8. A dozen. Something a paragraph could hold. Repeat the count, clerk. 231, Senator. As of this morning's filing. The tally is, the clerk consulted again, and something crossed his bored face for the first time, a small confusion, as though the paper had misbehaved. The tally is still open, Senator. Reports are still arriving. The count was 206 at the start of the session. 3 more were entered while the quorum was seating. 206 at the start of the session. 231 now. Rising, in the time it took a chamber to sit down, as more of the frontier's quiet impossible reports found their way at last to the top of the accord and into a clerk's open tally. Thessery Vaughan sat in the presiding chair of a quorum she had convened to spend an afternoon on a paragraph, and felt the housekeeping matter turn, under her hands, into the largest thing she would ever touch. She did not know yet what it would become. But she was old, and she had presided over 1,000 chambers, and she knew the specific silence that had just fallen, the silence of a great many reasonable people all realizing at once that the small problem is not small, and she knew that a chamber in that silence is the most dangerous thing in the galaxy, because it has just become frightened, and frightened chambers do not do housekeeping. They do history. This is the story of the afternoon the Accord found out it could not fold humanity, and of the reasonable room that took a reasonable problem and, by careful and civilized and individually defensible steps, talked itself into the first thing the Accord ever chose that it could not call anything but a crime. I want you to watch how reasonable it was. That is the whole horror of it. Nobody in that room was a monster. That was never the problem. The problem was arithmetic, and a chamber that had never once, in 100,000 years, had to choose between its mercy and its certainty. Ambassador Nadia Cole had come to the quorum to lose, and knew it, and had come anyway, because there is a kind of losing that is the only useful thing left to do. She was the Human Coalition's envoy to the Accord, which was a grand title for a lonely job, the job of being the one human in rooms that had already decided. She had held it for 6 years and she had learned its single hardest lesson, which was how a room feels in the moment it stops seeing you as a person and starts seeing you as a specimen, and she had felt that shift in enough chambers to know it was coming in this one before the clerk finished reading his terrible climbing number. She watched the faces of the quorum change as the count landed, watched 231 unresolved reckonings do to the room what no argument of hers ever could, and she thought, with the flat clarity of a diplomat who has lost rooms before, there it is. That is the sound of them deciding I am not a person. Now I find out what they decide I am instead. She let herself read the room while she still had the small grace period of silence a shocked chamber gives you, because a diplomat's whole craft is knowing a room before the room finishes knowing itself, and what she saw sorted, the way it always did, into a handful of particular faces she would be watching all afternoon instead of the abstraction of a quorum. There was Senator Perrine Dale, 2 benches down from the chair, a Velthani jurist Nadia had marked months earlier as the nearest thing to a friend the Human Coalition had in that building, and Dale's face had gone the specific still gray of a moderate discovering that the floor she had been standing on for a long career was thinner than she had ever had cause to price it. There was Senator Dreth Callum, an Orisk who had traded a marshal's collar for a Senate seat a decade before and worn the trade badly ever since, and Callum's face did not move at all, which Nadia had learned by then was not calm, it was the discipline of a soldier who has already finished an arithmetic the civilians around him are only now starting. And 3 rows back there was a face she did not yet have a name for, a senator so newly seated that the ceremonial collar still showed the full creases of its box, and his face did none of the things the older faces did, it simply went white and stayed white, in the particular way of a young man watching, for the first time, what his career was actually going to cost him to hold. She would learn his name before the day was out. It was Liz Farrow, and he was going to matter more than his rank suggested, though not in the way either of them would have wished. She had prepared, of course. She had a folder of testimony, a careful, humane, exhaustively reasonable case that the human anomaly was not a threat but a misunderstanding, that the frontier reports reflected the ordinary stubbornness of frontier people, that humanity wanted nothing but to be left to its gray little worlds, that there was no menace here, only difference. It was a good case. It was true, mostly. And Nadia Cole understood, watching the room, that it was already useless, because you cannot argue a frightened chamber out of a number, and the number was the argument now, and everything she had brought was going to break against it like water against a hull. So she did the only thing she had left, which was to change what she was there to do. She had come to win the room. She could not win the room. Very well, she would spend the room's own time making it look, once, directly, at what it was about to decide to fear, so that later, when the histories were written, no one could say the chamber had not been shown. She would not save her people this afternoon. She had known that, honestly, since the ship. What she could still do was witness, and warn, and carry home to the Human Coalition the one piece of intelligence that mattered more than any treaty, that the Accord had found the thing out, and that the finding was going to turn, by reasonable steps, into a decision, and that her people had better be ready for what a reasonable galaxy did when it decided you were a problem it could not fold. Senator, she said, rising, into the silence after the clerk. Before the quorum frames its question, I ask leave to put a face on the number. 231 is a large figure, and a large figure is a dangerous thing to reason about, because it stops sounding like people. I would like the chamber to hear about 3 of them, by name, before it decides what they are. It will take only a few minutes. I think you will find the minutes worth it. Vaughn, from the chair, inclined her head. The chamber will hear the ambassador. And Nadia Cole began to do the one thing she knew how to do against a number, which was to make it small again, one name at a time. She told them about a schoolteacher on a world called Ledgerton who kept the town's small records and taught its children in one room. She told them about a widower who set 2 cups at his table. She told them about a convoy of 4,000 that had crossed a place called the Straits carrying, among its cargo, a crate of apple cuttings, because someone had decided that a world worth fleeing was a world worth planting again. She told them, too, about a hydroponics technician on a moon called Fenrak who had kept broadcasting the weather to an evacuated station for 4 months after every ship that could have carried him out had already gone, because the handful of elderly residents who had refused to leave still needed to know when to shutter the vents against the dust, and no one had ordered him to stay and keep broadcasting, And no one was ever going to give him a medal for it, and he had done it anyway, alone. On a moon with his name on no manifest, because the alternative was a silence he found he could not produce. She told them about a girl of 12 on a relief convoy who had smuggled her family's cat through 3 separate customs stations because she had promised her younger brother she would keep it safe, and her brother had died of a frontier fever some months before the convoy ever sailed, and she had gone on keeping the promise anyway, to a boy who could no longer check whether she kept it, which was, Nadia told the chamber quietly, more promises than most living people manage to keep to each other. She watched Perrine Dale's composed gray face crack, just slightly, at the cat, a small human give at the corner of the mouth that Dale visibly worked to put away again. She watched Dreth Callum not move at all, which she was already learning to read correctly. And she watched the pale young senator 3 rows back wipe once, quickly, at his eye with the flat of his hand, as if the gesture might go unnoticed, and it did not go unnoticed, and no one in the chamber remarked on it, which was itself a kind of remark. She spoke of the particular against the general, the person against the specimen, the small warm true thing against the cold climbing number, and she was very good at it, and it did not work, and she watched it not work, and she kept doing it anyway, because it was the last honest use of her voice she was going to get. Thessery Vaughan listened to the ambassador put faces on the number, and was moved by it, and understood, this was the beginning of her long private horror, that being moved by it changed nothing at all. That was the thing the ambassador did not grasp, Vaughan thought, watching her, the chamber was not unmoved. That would have been survivable. A chamber of the unmoved you could shame, could appeal to, could turn with exactly the humane particular testimony the human was offering. But the quorum was moved. Vaughan could see it on the faces around her, the schoolteacher, the 2 cups, the apple cuttings had all landed, had all done their small warm work, and every senator in the room felt the pull of it, felt the humanity of the humans, and it made no difference whatsoever to where the afternoon was going, because the room's problem had never been a lack of feeling. Its problem was a surplus of arithmetic, and you cannot subtract 231 from a chamber's fear with a story about teacups, however true. She let the ambassador finish, because it was owed, and because a fair chair is the one power a presiding senator truly has, and then she opened the floor, and the afternoon began to do the thing she had spent her career preventing and was about to discover she could not prevent. She had chaired convenings long enough to read a room's temperature the way a physician reads a pulse, and what she read now, in the seconds after Nadia Cole sat down, was not the room she wanted. It was not a room moved toward mercy. It was a room moved, full stop, and a room that has just been moved and does not yet know what to do with the feeling will reach, every time, for whoever offers it a place to put the feeling down. Vaughan watched Perrine Dale dab at her eyes and knew, with the specific dread of someone who has seen this exact weather before, that Dale's grief was going to spend itself on the nearest available structure rather than change anything. She watched Dreth Callum's stillness and understood that he had not been moved at all, or had finished being moved somewhere off the record, in a war she had not been present for. And she watched Liz Farrow, 3 rows back, sit up very straight, the way the young sit up when they have decided, wrongly, that sitting straight is the same thing as being brave. Vaughan had chaired 40 years of convenings on the theory that a moved room was a room she could still steer. She did not yet know that this was the last afternoon on which that theory would hold, and so she opened the floor believing, as she always had, that time and a fair procedure were still, on balance, her allies. It was Senator Corvain Alt who framed it. Of course it was Alt. He was not a cruel man. Vaughan had known him 200 years and he was godfather to no small number of children and wept at the right operas, and that was exactly what made him so dangerous in a chamber like this one, because a cruel man's arguments can be dismissed as cruelty, and Alt's arguments were never cruel. They were reasonable. He rose, and he did not rant, and he did not hate, and he said the thing that Vaughn would hear in her sleep for the rest of her long life. "I want to be careful," Alt said, "because the ambassador has reminded us, rightly, that these are people, and I do not forget it, and I ask the chamber not to forget it. But I must follow the finding where it leads, and I ask the quorum to follow it with me, one honest step at a time. We have 231 worlds on which the fold was applied and did not take. That is not an anomaly anymore. An anomaly is one world. 231 is a law. The finding before us is that this species does not fold, that the mechanism by which we defeat an enemy without destroying it does not function against them. I do not say this with any pleasure. I say it because it is what the number says. Now, every senator in this room has built their life on a single proposition, the proposition that makes us a civilization and not a horde, that we do not destroy what we can fold. We are proud of that. We should be. It is the finest thing about us. But observe, colleagues, what that proposition rests on. It rests on can. We do not destroy what we can fold. It has never once occurred to us to ask what we do with what we cannot fold, because in 100,000 years there has never been such a thing. There is now. 231 times, there is now. And I put it to the chamber, with no pleasure and no cruelty, only the honesty the finding demands, if a people cannot be folded, and cannot therefore be defeated in the civilized way, and has furthermore, as the tactical hazard filings now show, learned to weaponize that very fact against us, then the question is no longer how do we fold them. The question is what do we do about a thing we cannot fold. And I would rather this chamber ask that question in the daylight, carefully, as a civilization, than have it forced on us in the dark by a frightened fleet. He sat down. He had not said the word. He was far too reasonable to say the word. But every senator in the room heard the shape of the room the word lived in, and Thessery Vaughan, in the chair, felt the whole afternoon tilt toward it, and understood that Corvain Alt had just done the most dangerous thing anyone could do in that chamber, which was to make the unthinkable into the next honest step. It was Perrine Dale who tried first to slow it, because Dale had spent her own long career 2 benches from Vaughan's chair learning the identical trade of the saving middle, and she rose now the way a swimmer rises against a current she has not yet recognized as a current. Senator Alt asks the chamber to follow the finding, she said, and I will follow it exactly as far as the finding goes and not one step further, because I notice that the finding tells us a fact about folding, and Senator Alt has quietly attached to that fact a conclusion about danger, and the finding does not say danger. 231 worlds that did not fold are 231 worlds that did not fold. They are not, on the record before us, 231 threats. I would ask the chamber to notice how much weight is being asked to travel across that unstated joint. It was, Vaughan thought, exactly the objection she herself would have made 20 years earlier, precise and true and entirely beside the point, because Alt did not need to win the joint, he only needed to leave it standing long enough for fear to cross it on its own, and he answered Dale with the same unhurried courtesy he answered everyone, the courtesy of a man who does not need to win quickly because he is confident he will win eventually. I have attached no conclusion the tactical hazard filings do not already supply, Alt said. Senator Dale is quite right that a world which does not fold is not, by that fact alone, a threat. I have never argued otherwise. But I would ask her, and the chamber, to read the filing appended as item 4, which the Guild has already accepted into this record without objection, and which documents an engagement in which our own doctrine was read back to us and used to destroy a squadron. That is not a hypothetical danger, Senator. That is a filed hazard note, with a case number, and a butcher's bill. I have not invented the joint Senator Dale is worried about. I am reading it to her from a document this chamber has already, by its own quiet and unanimous consent, admitted as true. Dale sat down. She had not been answered, exactly. She had been out-procedured, which in that chamber amounted to the same defeat, and Vaughn watched her sit with the particular stillness of a moderate, discovering that a true objection and a winning one are not always the same animal. Then Dreth Callum rose, uninvited by any softness in his own voice, and the chamber quieted for him in the specific way it quieted for anyone who had once commanded troops, because such senators, however civilian their caller now was, still carried the old authority of people who had signed casualty lists. I will say the plain version, since the senator from the reckoning bench is too careful to, Callum said, and did not look at Alt when he said it, which everyone in the chamber understood as its own kind of insult. I fought 2 campaigns against species that could be folded, and it did not make either campaign painless, and I am not sentimental about the value of a mechanism merely because it spares us the trouble of grieving what we destroy. But I will tell this chamber, as a soldier and not as a senator, that a doctrine which cannot end an engagement is not a doctrine. It is a standing invitation to keep engaging, indefinitely, at whatever cost the other side is willing to pay, and the filings before us say this species will pay any cost at all. I do not ask the chamber to hate them for that. I ask the chamber to be honest about what it means to fight, without end, an opponent with no floor under it. Senator Alt has found the honest question. I would rather we answer it than pretend, out of good manners, that no one has asked it. He sat. Nobody applauded, because the chamber did not applaud, but Vaughn felt the room settle around his words the way a house settles around a load it has just been asked to bear, and she understood that Alt's case had just acquired something it had not had before him, a soldier's plain endorsement, which read, to frighten civilians, as competence, and competence, in a frightened room, reads as safety, and safety is the thing a frightened room will vote for before it will vote for almost anything else. Nadia Cole sat through Alt's speech with her face composed and her hands still, the diplomat's discipline, and underneath it she felt the specific grief of a person watching a thing she cannot stop arrive exactly on schedule. She had heard the shape of Alt's argument before, though never so well made. It was the argument that always came, in every room that decided a people was a problem, the reasonable man, following the honest, finding one honest step at a time, arriving without cruelty at the edge of an atrocity and inviting everyone to look over it together as responsible adults. She had answered it before, in smaller rooms, and lost, and she rose now to answer it again, not because she thought she would win but because the record had to show that it was answered. Senator Alt says he will follow the finding where it leads, she said. I ask him, and the chamber, to look at where he has already decided it leads before he has taken a single one of his honest steps. He says the question is what to do about a thing we cannot fold. But listen to the word he has used for my people. A thing. He has spent his reason, ably, to turn 231 worlds of people, school teachers, widowers, farmers, children, the whole ordinary human weight of them, into a thing, a problem, and once you have done that, senators, once you have made a people into a problem, the honest steps all run one direction, and everyone who walks them can tell themselves they were only being reasonable. You cannot fold us. That is true. I will not stand here and tell you a comfortable lie, because the lie would insult you and I have too much respect for this chamber to try it. You cannot fold us. But hear why, because the why is everything, and Senator Alt has skipped past it. You cannot fold us because we do not break together. Each of us breaks alone, or does not, in our own separate heart, and there is no moment when we all agree to stop, because there is no us that decides as one. That is not a weapon. It is not a menace. It is the loneliest fact about my species, that we grieve one at a time in 10,000 separate rooms and cannot pool it and cannot be relieved of it together. Senator Alt calls it a thing we cannot fold and asks what to do about it. I call it a widower washing a cup his wife will never drink from, and I ask you to see that there is nothing to be done about it, because it is not a problem. It is just a people, grieving the way we grieve, alone, asking only to be left to it. Dreth Callum was the one who answered her, not with argument but with a soldier's plain question, asked without malice, and for that reason more dangerous than malice would have been. "Ambassador," he said, "I accept every word of what you have told us about your widower and his cup. I do not doubt any of it is true. But answer me this, plainly, because I intend to vote today and I would like to vote on a truth rather than a feeling. If your people cannot be folded, and cannot therefore be stopped the way this accord has stopped every other people it has ever needed to stop, then how, in fact, are they to be stopped, should a day ever come when stopping them is necessary? I am not asking you to tell me they are dangerous, Ambassador. I am asking you to tell this chamber what it is supposed to do if they ever are." It was the fairest question anyone had put to her all day, and Nadia understood, hearing it, that it was also the most lethal one, because there was no honest answer to it that did not feed exactly the fear she had come to starve. "There is no answer to that question that will comfort you, Senator," she said, "because the true answer is that you do not stop us the way you have stopped everyone else, and I will not invent a comforting mechanism that does not exist, only to make this chamber feel safer about the vote it is going to take today. I can tell you what has always, eventually, worked on my people, in every dark chapter of our own short history, and it is not force, and it is not a threshold. It is time, and patience, and being left long enough alone to want peace on our own account, which is a slower and far less certain thing than a fold, and I understand perfectly well that a slower and less certain thing is a hard sentence for a frightened chamber to accept from the one witness it has left to distrust." It was true, and it satisfied no one, and she watched Callum nod once, courteously, and settle back into his seat, having received the only kind of answer he had actually expected, which confirmed for him everything he had already privately decided before he ever raised his hand to ask. It was, she thought, the best she had. It was true and it was human and it named the very heart of the thing. And she watched it land in the room, watched some of the senators feel it, and watched it change nothing, because she had just confirmed, in the plainest possible terms, the exact fact the room was afraid of. She had told a frightened chamber, honestly, that its enemy could not be folded, and no eloquence about the loneliness of it could unfrighten a room that had just heard its deepest tool declared useless from the mouth of the people it could not use it on. She sat down knowing she had helped. Not the humans, herself, and the record. She had confirmed the finding. She had, in the act of humanizing it, verified it. That was the trap of the reasonable room. Every true thing you said became evidence, and the only way not to feed the fear was to lie, and she would not lie, and so she fed it, and she knew she fed it, and she did it anyway because a lie would have cost her the one thing she was really there to keep, which was the right to go home and tell her people the truth about what she had seen. Vaughan called the question on Alt's motion to reclassify the human matter from a reckoning anomaly to a security finding before the ambassador had fully settled back into her chair, because procedure does not pause for grief, and Vaughan, of all the people in that chamber, knew it and used it, the way a fair chair uses procedure, without cruelty, and without mercy either. The vote was not close. Nadia watched it happen with the specific, cataloging attention of someone memorizing the scene of a crime. She watched Perrine Dale, whose composed face had cracked at the schoolteacher and the cat and the 2 cups, raise her hand for the motion anyway, because Dale had been out-procedured an hour before and had nothing left to vote with except the finding, and the finding said what it said. She watched Dreth Callum vote for it without any change of expression at all, a soldier ratifying an assessment he had already completed before the session ever opened. And she watched the pale young senator 3 rows back, Liz Farrow, hold his hand in his lap for 3 full seconds after the clerk called for the ayes, 3 seconds in which Nadia let herself hope, honestly and uselessly hope, that one person in that chamber was about to be the exception the whole afternoon needed, and then she watched him raise it, quickly, to the same height as everyone else's hand, because it is a very hard thing, in a full chamber, in your first term, to be the only hand not raised, and Pharaoh was not able to do the hard thing, and Nadia did not blame him for it, particularly, because she had learned, across 6 years in rooms like this one, that the entire machinery of a reasonable atrocity runs on precisely that ordinary, forgivable, catastrophic failure of nerve, multiplied by everyone in the room at once. The motion carried by a wide margin. The finding that had been, an hour earlier, only a fact about folding was now, procedurally, officially, also a security matter, and Nadia understood that she had just watched the first honest step get taken directly over the top of the truest thing she had said all day. I want to step out of the chamber for a moment, because the most important thing about that afternoon is a thing no one in the room could see, and you can only see it from outside, from the cold vantage of someone reading the record a long time later. Nobody voted for an atrocity. That is the thing to understand. If you read the transcript of the quorum, and it survives, it was a formal proceeding of the accord and every word was kept, you will not find a single senator rising to propose the destruction of the human species. You will find, instead, a sequence of small, reasonable, individually defensible motions, each one carried by a comfortable majority of decent people, and you will only see where they were going if you read them all together, which no one in the room did, because no one in the room was reading all of them together. They were each reading the one in front of them. A motion to reclassify the human matter from a reckoning anomaly to a security finding. Reasonable, the tactical hazard filings did suggest a security dimension. Carried, as you have already seen it carried, over the ambassador's testimony and past Senator Dale's raised hand. Then a motion to establish a standing committee to study the containment of unfoldable populations. Reasonable, a novel problem deserves study. Who could object to study? Senator Dale tried to object anyway, one more time, because losing the first vote had not cured her of the habit of trying. She rose and asked only that the committee's charter contain the word study and nothing that could later be read as more than study, a modest amendment, a single clause, and Alt accepted it without a fight, graciously, almost warmly, because he had learned something in the reclassification vote that Vaughn would spend the rest of her life understanding too late, that he did not need to win every clause, he only needed the committee to exist, and a committee that exists acquires, by the plain mechanics of institutions, its own hunger for a mandate, regardless of the modest word printed at the top of its charter. The amendment passed. The motion carried. Dale sat down believing she had softened something. She had, in fact, only made it easier for the rest of the chamber to vote for. A third motion, then, to authorize that committee to develop contingency doctrine, up to and including the full range of options, because responsible planning does not exclude possibilities in advance. It was Vaughn herself who intervened first, handing the gavel to a junior colleague for a few minutes so that she could speak from her own seat as a senator rather than rule from the chair as its keeper, and moving to amend the motion, before the chamber voted on its substance, with a plain limiting clause, short of the destruction of a species entire, the kind of sentence she had used across 40 years to save 100 committees from their own worst instincts. She believed, rising to offer it, that she was drawing the one line in the whole afternoon that actually mattered. Alt did not oppose it. That was the detail she would turn over for the rest of her life afterward, the small ordinary fact that he simply let it pass, graciously, as though it cost him nothing, and perhaps it did cost him nothing, because a committee instructed to develop contingency doctrine short of the destruction of a species entire is still a committee instructed to develop contingency doctrine, and the clause she was so quietly proud of limited nothing about what such a committee could eventually recommend. Only what it would be permitted to call the recommendation on the day it came time to write it down. The amendment passed, unanimously, the only unanimous vote of the whole afternoon, and Vaughn sat down believing she had built a wall into the machine's design that would hold. It would be a long time, and it would cost her a great deal, before she understood that Alt had not resisted her compromise because her compromise had never been a wall. It had only ever been a coat of paint. And then, so amended, the motion itself came to the floor, and here, finally, someone other than the ambassador fought it in the open. Dreth Callum, of all the senators in that chamber, rose against the phrase full range of options, not because he doubted the necessity Alt had built so carefully across the whole afternoon, but because he had spent a career reading exactly that phrase in orders he had been given, and had learned, the hard way, to distrust the comfort civilians take in language soft enough to mean anything at all. Say what you mean, Callum told the chamber, or do not vote on it. I have signed orders written in words like these and watched juniors read into them whatever their commanders needed them to mean once the shooting started. If this committee is to be authorized to consider the destruction of a people, then the motion should say destruction, and this chamber should have the honesty to vote on the true word, and live afterward with having voted on it. It was, Vaughn thought later, the single most honest sentence spoken in that chamber all day, and it changed nothing, because Alt rose again, unhurried, and observed only that Senator Callum's proposed language would prejudge the committee's findings before the committee had even convened, which was, on its face, true, and procedurally unanswerable, and the motion passed as written, soft words and Vaughn's own clause both intact, by a smaller margin than the first two, and with a silence after it that some of the senators would remember for the rest of their lives, a silence Dreth Callum sat through with his jaw set and one hand pressed flat against his own knee, as if to keep it from ever being raised again for anything. Each step was reasonable. Each step was a comfortable majority. And the sum of the reasonable steps was a chamber that had, over the course of a single civilized afternoon, built the entire apparatus by which a later generation would decide to make an example of a human world, would apply not force to a threshold, because there was no threshold, but erasure, total and deliberate, to a colony called Anvil, in order to prove to a galaxy that the unfoldable could still be made to stop. None of that happened in the quorum. All of it became possible in the quorum. That is what a reasonable room does with a fear it cannot resolve. It does not commit the crime. It builds, in daylight, with clean hands and good procedure, the machine that will commit the crime for it later, so that when the crime comes no one who built the machine will have to feel that they were the one who chose it. They were only being reasonable. They were only taking the honest next step. The transcript proves it. Every word was kept. Thessery Vaughn did not vote for any of it, and presided over all of it, and understood, somewhere in the third reasonable motion, that presiding over it was the vote. She had spent her whole long career as the chamber's great moderate, the finder of the saving compromise, the senator who could always locate the reasonable middle that let a frightened room step back from a cliff. It was her gift and her pride, the way reading enemies had been a tactician's, the way the book had been a marshal's, and like theirs, it was about to fail her at the one moment it mattered, and for the same reason, because she was so certain of it that she could not see it had stopped working. She kept reaching for the middle. That was her whole strategy through the long afternoon, and it was a good strategy for every chamber she had ever chaired except this one. When Alt framed the humans as a thing to be contained, she did not fight the frame. Fighting the frame would have been unreasonable, would have cost her the room's trust, would have made her a partisan instead of a chair. She instead worked to soften it, to slow it, to amend the containment committee's mandate toward study rather than action, to buy time, one more session, one more submission, because time had always been the moderate's friend, because a chamber given time cools, and a cooled chamber does the small sensible thing instead of the large terrible one. She worked the recess the way she had worked 40 years of recesses, quietly, in the corridor outside the chamber, where the real business of a convening is so often done in the gaps between its formal motions. She found Perrine Dale by the water station and told her, gently, that the study amendment had been the right instinct even though it had not held the way either of them had hoped, that a moderate's job on a day like this one was to keep chipping at the edges even when the center refused to move, and Dale, who was not comforted, thanked her anyway, because it is so much easier to accept a comfort than to say aloud that the comfort is not working. She found Liz Farrow sitting alone on a bench meant for pages, and asked him, kindly, how he was finding his first convening, and Farrow told her, in the flat, over-careful voice of a man reciting a sentence he had already decided in advance to say, that he thought the chamber was proceeding very responsibly. Vaughn heard, underneath the recitation, the sound of a young man teaching himself the exact vocabulary of self-protection that would let him vote however the room voted for the next 40 years of his life, and she recognized the sound perfectly, because it had once been her own, learned in a corridor much like this one, from a senator who must have looked, to her then, very much like she looked to Farrow now. She found she had nothing to say to him that would not have been a lie, so she only nodded, and moved on, and told herself on the way back to the chair that she had done the boy a small kindness, and was not, walking away from him, entirely sure that she had. And every softening she one-handed alt the frame. That was the thing she saw, too late, in the third motion, that by refusing to fight the framing of humanity as a problem, and fighting only over what to do about the problem, she had conceded the one point that mattered. Once the chamber agreed humanity was a problem to be solved, the moderates and the hardliners were only arguing about the speed of the solution, and arguing about the speed of a solution is a way of agreeing that there will be one. Her compromises were not slowing the machine. They were building it carefully, which is worse than building it fast, because a carefully built machine is one no one can later disown. Nadia Cole understood this. Vaughn could see it on the human's still, composed face across the chamber, could see the ambassador watching her reach again and again for a middle that did not exist, and there was no contempt in the human's expression, which was the unbearable part. There was pity. The human envoy, who was losing everything, pitied the Velthani senator who was winning every small vote, because the human could see what the senator could not quite let herself see, that Thessery Vaughn's reasonableness was the load-bearing wall of the whole terrible edifice, that a chamber this frightened could only have been walked to the edge of genocide by someone it trusted to be reasonable, and that Vaughn's entire distinguished career had made her into exactly the instrument such an afternoon required, a moderate whose every compromise made the unthinkable 1 degree more procedural, 1 degree more defensible, 1 degree more done. There was a moment, she would return to it for the rest of her life, when she could have stopped it. Late in the afternoon, before the final motion, she held the chair and the floor and the trust of the room, and she understood, in a flash of cold clarity, that the only thing that could halt the machine was for its most reasonable member to become, suddenly and violently, unreasonable, to rise from the chair and refuse the frame, to say the true wild thing, that this chamber was building a crime and that she would burn her own standing to the ground before she presided over another motion of it. She even had the sentence ready. She could feel its exact shape in her mouth: I will not preside over this. Find yourselves another chair. It was a plain sentence, the kind she had used 1,000 times before to end committee business she had judged had gone on long enough, and it would have cost her every single thing that made her Thessery Vaughan, and she held it there a moment, the way you hold a coin you are on the verge of spending, turning it over, feeling its whole weight, with her hand resting on the gavel and the room, for one suspended second, entirely hers to spend it in. It would have cost her everything. It might not have worked. But it was the only move left on the board, and Thessery Vaughan, who had never in 200 years made an unreasonable move, found that she could not make one now, could not become in a single afternoon the opposite of everything she was, and so she stayed in the chair, and kept the procedure fair, and let the reasonable machine finish building itself, because being reasonable was the only self she had, And she could not set it down even to save what setting it down might have saved. By the time the chamber reached its last order of business, most of the afternoon's audience had already gone back to being a room full of tired legislators rather than a body that had just built something enormous. Clerks were stacking the day's motions into their folders. A handful of senators had already left for evening appointments they would not, years later, remember they had kept on this particular day. Perrine Dale had not left. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the floor the way a person watches a fire she is fairly sure she started by accident. Dreth Callum had gone the moment the last vote was gavelled, without ceremony, the way a soldier leaves a briefing once the orders are cut and there is nothing further to be gained by staying to hear them read again. Liz Farrow had not left, and would not, for years afterward, be entirely sure why he had stayed, except that some instinct in him too young yet to have a name understood that whatever was about to happen in the chamber's last few minutes was the part of the day actually worth witnessing. Near the end, when it was done in all the ways that mattered and only the formal record remained to be closed, Ambassador Nadia Cole asked for the floor one last time, and Senator Vaughn, from the chair, gave it to her, and the two women looked at each other across the chamber, the one who had lost and the one who had won, and understood each other completely, which was its own kind of grief. "I will not make another argument," Nadia said. "The chamber has heard my arguments and found them true and voted past them, which is the worst thing a chamber can do, worse than finding them false, because it means the room knows exactly what it is doing. So I will not argue. I will only put one thing in the record, for later, for whoever reads this when the afternoon's work has ripened into whatever it is going to ripen into. You have decided today that my people are a problem. You have been very careful and very reasonable and no one here has said an unkind word, and by the end of it you will have built, out of careful and reasonable and kindly worded pieces, a machine whose only purpose is to answer the question of what to do with a people you cannot fold. And I want the record to show that I told you, on the day you built it, what the answer to that question is, so that no one who reads this later can pretend they did not know. There is nothing to be done with us. We are not a problem. We are a people who grieve alone and cannot be folded and want only to be left to our gray worlds. You cannot solve us, because we are not a puzzle. You can only leave us be, or destroy us, and the machine you have built today does not have leave us be among its options, because you took that option off the table in the last motion of the day and called it responsible planning. So I know where this ends. I have known since the count passed 200. And I am going to go home now, and I am going to tell my people that the Accord has found out what we are, and that a reasonable room decided we were a problem, and that reasonable rooms that decide you are a problem do not, in the end, leave you be. Get ready, I am going to tell them. Not because they hate us. Because they are afraid, and they are reasonable, and there is nothing more dangerous in the galaxy than a reasonable thing that is afraid. She gathered her folder of useless humane testimony, and she inclined her head to the chair, to Thessery Vaughn, without irony, one exhausted public servant to another. And she left the chamber, and went home to warn her species, and the quorum closed its record, and the machine it had built sat waiting, patient and procedural and clean, for the generation that would feed a world called Anvil into it and call the feeding an example. I told you to watch how reasonable it was, and now that you have, let me say the thing the transcript cannot, because the transcript kept every word and still missed the whole of it. The Accord did not decide to destroy humanity on the afternoon of the quorum. I want to be precise about that, because it matters. No one voted for it. No one proposed it. If you had stopped any senator in that chamber and accused them of building toward genocide, they would have been genuinely, woundedly appalled, and they would have been telling the truth, because not one of them had done any such thing. Each of them had only taken the honest next step. Each of them had only been reasonable. That was the whole catastrophe. The Accord had spent 100,000 years being a civilization that folded its enemies instead of destroying them, and it had come to believe that this made it good, when in fact it had only ever made it lucky that every enemy it met could be folded, so that its mercy and its victory always pointed the same way and it never once had to choose between them. The humans were the end of that luck. They were the first enemy the Accord could not both defeat and spare. And a chamber full of decent people, forced for the first time in their history to choose between their mercy and their certainty, discovered on a single reasonable afternoon that they would choose their certainty, and would do it carefully, and would keep the transcript clean. Thessery Vaughan presided over it to the end, and never made the unreasonable move that might have stopped it, and lived a long time afterward in the full knowledge that her reasonableness had been the machine's load-bearing wall. She was not a villain. She would have given anything to have been a villain instead, because a villain could have repented, and she had nothing to repent of, only a lifetime of good judgment that had, at the one moment it counted, judged well and small and safely while something enormous and terrible built itself in the room she was fairly, reasonably, unforgivably chairing. And Nadia Cole went home and told her people to get ready, and they did not entirely believe her, because it is very hard to believe that a reasonable galaxy full of decent people is going to decide you are a problem and build a machine to solve you. But she was right. The count that afternoon had been 231, and rising, and every one of those unresolved reckonings had a document behind it now, filed by someone on the frontier who had met the humans and come back knowing the thing the Accord could not survive knowing, a reckoner's empty box, a salvage crew's 4 words, a marshal's blank line, a scholar's sealed monograph, a tactician's hazard note, and now, joining them, the fattest file of all, the clean and careful transcript of the reasonable afternoon on which the Accord, choosing at last between its mercy and its certainty, chose its certainty, and wrote every word down, and did not understand, because it never once read them all together, that it had just recorded the exact moment its long civilization decided to become the thing it had spent 100,000 years being proud of not being. Somewhere, eventually, someone was going to read them all together. That was the one mercy left in it, and it was a cold one, and it was a long way off.